Tonight, we begin a calm journey through one of America's most beloved folk tales. It's a peaceful story about a gentle man who walked across the frontier, planting apple seeds and spreading kindness wherever he went. Let your mind settle as we drift back to a simpler time, when the land was young and one person's quiet work could change the world. But before we drift into tonight's sleep story, my name's Murphy. If these stories help you relax, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you'd like, share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always beautiful to see people winding down together across the world under the same night sky. Now, let's dim the lights and let the story roll. Our story begins with a boy named John Chapman. He was born in Massachusetts in the year 1774, during a time when America itself was still very young. The land was different then. There were fewer roads, fewer towns, and far more wilderness than anyone living today could easily imagine. John came into the world in the small town of Leominster. It was a quiet place where everyone knew their neighbors, and life moved at the pace of the seasons. His father was a farmer and a Minuteman who had fought in the Revolutionary War. His mother was gentle and kind, but she passed away when John was still very small, leaving behind memories that would fade like morning mist. Growing up without a mother was difficult for young John. But his father remarried after some time, and John gained a stepmother who cared for him alongside his new brothers and sisters. The house was modest, with wooden floors that creaked in the night and windows that let in the soft light of New England mornings. Outside, there were fields that needed tending and forests that whispered with every breeze. John was not like other children in some ways. While other boys his age played rough games or dreamed of becoming soldiers or merchants, John found his peace among the trees and streams. He would wander into the woods near his home, walking slowly through the undergrowth, watching how sunlight filtered through the leaves overhead. He learned to recognize different plants and trees. He could tell an oak from a maple just by the shape of their leaves. He knew which berries were safe to eat and which streams had the coldest, clearest water. The forest became like a second home to him, a place where everything made sense in its own quiet way. His father taught him practical things, how to plant seeds in straight rows, how to prune a fruit tree so it would grow strong and bear more apples, how to work hard without complaining, and how to find satisfaction in simple labor. These lessons stayed with John throughout his entire life, shaping the man he would become. After the Revolutionary War ended, the country was still finding its way. Many families were poor, and life required constant work just to have enough food and shelter. John's family was no different. They grew what they could, and made do with what they had. But even in those hard times, there was a sense of possibility in the air. America was a new nation, and the western lands beyond the original colonies seemed endless and full of promise. John's father kept a small orchard near their home. It wasn't large, just a dozen trees or so, but those apple trees were important to the family. Apples could be eaten fresh in the autumn, stored in root cellars for winter, dried for travel, or pressed into cider that would last through the cold months. John learned how apple trees grew from seeds, though his father explained that most farmers didn't plant seeds directly. Instead, they used a method called grafting, where a branch from a good tree was attached to a young rootstock. This ensured that the apples would taste the same as the parent tree. But John was fascinated by the seeds themselves. Each one held the potential for something new, something that might be different from what came before. He would sit beneath the apple trees in spring when they bloomed with white and pink flowers. The scent was sweet and delicate, and bees hummed lazily from blossom to blossom. In autumn, when the apples ripened and hung heavy on the branches, John would help with the harvest. He learned to judge which apples were ready to pick and which needed more time in the sun. There was something almost magical about apples to John. They were practical and useful, yes, but they were also beautiful in their simple way. An apple tree in bloom was a sign that winter was truly over. An apple tree bearing fruit meant that families would have food when they needed it most. As John grew older, he heard more and more stories about the western frontier. Traders and travelers would pass through town occasionally, bringing tales of vast forests, clear rivers, and land that stretched as far as the eye could see. These western lands were being opened up for settlement. Families were moving beyond the original 13 colonies, heading into what was then called the Northwest Territory, places that would later become Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. John was drawn to these stories. He imagined what it would be like to walk through forests where no roads existed, to see rivers that had never been crossed by bridges, to stand in meadows where the grass grew taller than a man's head. The idea of such open, untouched land called to something deep inside him. But it wasn't just the adventure that appealed to John. He began to think about the settlers who were moving west, about the challenges they would face. They would need to clear land, build homes, plant crops, and establish orchards. They would need apple trees, because apples were essential for survival on the frontier, and someone would need to help them get those trees started. An idea began to form in John's mind. It was a simple idea, but it would shape the rest of his life. What if he went west ahead of the settlers? What if he planted apple nurseries in places where families would eventually arrive? The settlers wouldn't have to wait years for their own trees to grow. They could buy young trees that were already started, already strong enough to transplant, and begin bearing fruit sooner. John was in his early 20s when he made his decision. He would leave Massachusetts and travel west, carrying apple seeds with him. He would plant nurseries along the frontier and help settlers establish their new homes. It was a plan that required faith, because there was no guarantee of success. But John had never been driven by the need for wealth or comfort. He wanted something different from life, something that felt meaningful and good. He gathered apple seeds carefully. After the harvest season, when apples were being pressed for cider at local mills, John would collect the leftover seeds. These seeds were usually thrown away or fed to animals, but John saw their potential. He cleaned them, dried them, and stored them in bags. He collected hundreds of seeds and then thousands, preparing for the long journey ahead. His family didn't fully understand his plan. His father thought he should stay and help with the farm. His stepmother worried about the dangers of traveling alone through wilderness. But John's mind was made up. He had a gentle stubbornness about him, a quiet determination that couldn't be easily swayed. He didn't take much with him when he finally left. A bag of apple seeds, a small cooking pot, a knife, some extra clothes, though not many. John believed in living simply, without unnecessary possessions. He thought that the less he carried, the freer he would be. On a cool morning in early spring, John Chapman said goodbye to his family. He didn't know exactly where he was going or when he might return. He simply started walking west, following rough trails and wagon roads that led away from the settled towns of New England and toward the wild frontier beyond. The journey west was long and slow, John didn't rush. He walked at a steady pace, covering perhaps 15 or 20 miles on a good day, less when the terrain was difficult. He followed paths that wound through dense forests where the trees grew so thick that little sunlight reached the ground. He crossed streams by stepping carefully from stone to stone, and when the streams were too wide, he would wade through the cold water without complaint. The forests of early America were different from what exists today. They were older, wilder, more mysterious. Giant trees rose up like cathedral pillars, their trunks so wide that it would take several men with outstretched arms to circle them. The forest floor was soft with centuries of fallen leaves. Everywhere there was the sound of birds singing, branches creaking, and water flowing over ancient stones. John traveled through Pennsylvania first, making his way slowly towards the western edge of the state. The Allegheny Mountains rose before him, their peaks shrouded in mist. The climb was difficult, but John was patient. He would walk for a while, then rest, walk some more, then stop to drink from a spring, or eat a simple meal of cornmeal mush or dried apples from his pack. At night, John would find a place to sleep beneath the stars. Sometimes he built a small fire for warmth and to cook a simple supper. Other times, he simply wrapped himself in his coat and laid down on a bed of soft pine needles. He wasn't afraid of the darkness or the sounds of the forest at night. The howling of distant wolves or the rustling of unseen creatures didn't trouble him. He felt at home in the wilderness, more at home, perhaps, than he had ever felt in any town. As John traveled west, he began to encounter pioneer families. These were people who had left the crowded eastern states in search of new opportunities. They traveled in covered wagons loaded with all their possessions, furniture, tools, seeds, chickens in wooden crates, perhaps a cow or two tied behind the wagon. The settlers were often tired and worried. The journey was hard on everyone, especially children and the elderly. There were rivers to cross, mountains to climb, and always the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Would they find good land? Would they be able to build a home before winter came? Would their children stay healthy? John would approach these traveling families with a gentle greeting. He didn't look like a typical traveler. His clothes were worn and patched. He often went barefoot, even on rocky trails, because he believed shoes were an unnecessary comfort. Sometimes he wore a tin pot on his head instead of a proper hat, which made children giggle and adults smile despite their worries. But when John spoke, people listened. His voice was calm and kind. He would ask where they were headed and tell them about the land ahead. He shared what he knew about good camping spots, where to find fresh water, which trails were easiest to follow. He would talk about the soil in different areas, which places were best for farming, where apple trees would grow strongest. And then John would tell them about his mission. He was planting apple nurseries ahead of the settlements, he explained. In a few years, when they were ready to establish orchards, there would be young trees waiting for them. Good, strong trees that were already growing and would be ready to transplant. The settlers were often amazed by this idea. Here was a man who expected nothing in return, who was thinking about their future needs before they had even arrived at their new homes. John loved to sit with settler families around their evening campfires. The firelight would flicker on their faces as the sky darkened overhead. Children would lean against their parents, tired from the day's travel. John would share stories from his own journey, describing the beautiful places he had seen, the interesting people he had met, the way certain flowers bloomed in spring, or how the autumn leaves turned the whole forest into a tapestry of gold and crimson. Sometimes John would share apple seeds with the families, giving them small handfuls wrapped in cloth. He would explain how to plant them, how deep to bury them, how much water they would need. He told them that patience was important. Apple trees grew slowly, but they lived for many years and would feed multiple generations of a family. John also shared other things. He carried with him a few books, especially a Bible and some religious writings that he treasured. He would read aloud to families who gathered around to listen. His voice was soothing as he read passages about kindness, about caring for others, about living simply and finding joy in small blessings. He wasn't pushy or preachy about it. He simply shared what brought him comfort and peace. Many families remembered these evenings for the rest of their lives. There was something special about this strange, gentle man who appeared out of the wilderness like a character from a fairy tale. He brought hope when people were discouraged. He brought practical help with his knowledge of the land. And he brought a reminder that there was still goodness in the world, still people who cared about others without wanting anything in return. John didn't just talk about planting apple trees. He did it constantly as he traveled. Whenever he found a good spot, near a stream, in a clearing, anywhere that seemed likely to eventually attract settlers, he would stop and plant seeds. His method was simple but effective. He would clear a small area of undergrowth, loosen the soil with a stick or his hands, and carefully place several seeds in the ground. He would cover them gently, sometimes marking the spot with stones so he could find it again. He worked quietly, methodically, as if he were performing a kind of ritual. John understood that many of these seeds would never grow into full trees. Some would be eaten by animals. Some would fail to sprout. Some would start growing, but then die from drought or disease. But John also knew that enough would survive. Nature was generous that way. If you planted many seeds, some would always find a way to thrive. As the months passed and John continued his westward journey, he left behind a trail of planted seeds. They lay dormant in the earth through winter, then began to sprout when spring arrived. Tiny green shoots pushed up through the soil, reaching for sunlight. The ones that survived the first year would grow stronger. By the second year, they would be small saplings. By the third or fourth year, they would be ready to transplant. John kept mental notes of where he had planted his nurseries. He had a remarkable memory for landscapes and locations. He could remember specific trees, certain rock formations, the way a particular stream bent and flowed. This allowed him to return to his planting sites later to check on their progress. John owned almost nothing, and this was by choice. He believed that possessions weighed a person down, both physically and spiritually. The less he had, the freer he felt. He could walk all day without being burdened. He could change direction on a whim. He could sleep anywhere without worrying about protecting valuable belongings. His clothes were simple and often ragged. He wore whatever was given to him, or whatever he could trade for. Sometimes he wore a coffee sack with holes cut for his arms and head. Other times he wore cast-off clothes that settlers no longer needed. He rarely wore shoes, preferring to feel the earth directly beneath his feet. His famous tin pot served multiple purposes. He could cook with it, drink from it, and wear it on his head for protection from sun and rain. People sometimes laughed at John's appearance, but never in a mean-spirited way. There was something endearing about his complete lack of vanity. He didn't care what he looked like. He didn't care about impressing anyone. This freedom from social expectations made him seem almost otherworldly, like a monk or a holy wanderer from ancient times. John rarely stayed in one place for long. He would spend a few days or weeks in an area, planting his nurseries and visiting with any settlers who happened to be nearby. Then he would move on, always heading generally westward, always following the expanding frontier. John slept outdoors in every season. In summer, this was pleasant enough. He would find a soft spot beneath a tree, lie down on the ground, and drift off while watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The night sounds of the forest were his lullaby. Crickets chirping, frogs calling from nearby ponds, the occasional hoot of an owl. In autumn, he would gather extra leaves to make a softer bed and provide some insulation as the nights grew cooler. The autumn stars were particularly bright, and John would sometimes lie awake for a while, thinking about the seeds he had planted and imagining the trees they would become. Winter was harder, of course. John would seek some shelter then, perhaps a hollow log or a simple lean-to he constructed from branches and bark. Sometimes he would stay for a few weeks at a settler's cabin, helping them with work in exchange for a place by their fire. But even in winter, John often preferred to sleep outside. He would build a larger fire, bank the coals to keep them burning through the night, and sleep as close to the warmth as he safely could. Spring was John's favorite season. Everything came alive again after the long winter. His planted seeds would begin to sprout. The forest would fill with wildflowers and migrating birds. The air would smell like rain and fresh earth and new growth. On spring mornings, John would wake to find the world transformed, and he would give thanks for another day of life and work. John Chapman didn't give himself the name Johnny Appleseed. It came from the people he met, the settlers and pioneers who heard about his work and began to tell stories about him. At first, people simply called him John Chapman, or sometimes just the Appleseed Man. But over time, as his reputation spread and more people encountered him on the frontier trails, the name evolved into something more memorable, more folksy and friendly. Johnny Appleseed. It fit him perfectly. Johnny was a casual, affectionate name, the kind you'd give to a friend or a favorite uncle. And Appleseed described exactly what he was about, spreading apple seeds across the land. The name had a musical quality to it, easy to remember and easy to say. John didn't mind the nickname. If anything, he seemed pleased by it. The name suggested that people understood his purpose, that his work was being recognized and appreciated. Within a few years, more people knew him as Johnny Appleseed than as John Chapman. The name would eventually become legendary, spoken around campfires and dinner tables, passed down from parents to children as part of America's growing collection of folk tales. After several years of traveling and planting throughout Pennsylvania, Johnny Appleseed made his way into Ohio. This was the early 1800s, and Ohio was right on the edge of the American frontier. The land had only recently been opened for settlement. Native Americans still lived throughout the region, and many areas had never seen a plow or an axe. Ohio was beautiful in a way that took Johnny's breath away. There were forests of oak, hickory, and walnut trees. There were meadows where the grass grew so tall and thick that it looked like a green ocean. There were rivers and streams everywhere, their water clear and cold and teeming with fish. The soil was rich and dark, perfect for farming. But it was also challenging land. The forests were so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground in some places. Clearing land for farming would take years of back-breaking work. Stumps had to be removed, fields had to be plowed, and cabins had to be built. Winters were harsh, with deep snow and bitter cold. Summers could be hot and humid, with insects and mosquitoes that made life miserable. Johnny saw opportunity here. Settlers would be coming to Ohio in increasing numbers. They would need apple trees, not just for food, but for cider, which was the most common drink of the time. Clean water wasn't always easy to find, and milk required keeping cows. But apple cider could be made in large quantities and would keep through the winter. Johnny had developed a good eye for where to plant his nurseries. He looked for several things. First, he wanted land near water, a river or reliable stream, where the young trees could get moisture during dry spells. Second, he wanted land that would eventually attract settlers, usually near natural trails or rivers that could be used for transportation. Third, he wanted soil that would support apple trees, which meant avoiding areas that were too sandy or too rocky. When Johnny found a good spot, he would spend several days there preparing and planting. He would clear away undergrowth and fallen branches. He would mark out rows where he would plant his seeds. Then he would carefully plant the seeds he had been carrying, placing them at the right depth and spacing them properly so the young trees would have room to grow. Johnny didn't just plant and leave. He would often build a simple fence around his nursery using fallen branches and saplings. This helped protect the young seedlings from deer and other animals that might browse on the tender shoots. He would also clear away competing plants that might shade out his apple seedlings before they could establish themselves. One of the most remarkable things about Johnny's work was his dedication to returning to his nurseries. He would plant a nursery in one location, then move on to plant another elsewhere. But he would keep track of all his planting sites and would return months or years later to check on their progress. When Johnny came back to a nursery, he would spend time caring for the young trees. He would pull weeds that threatened to choke the saplings. He would prune branches to encourage strong growth. If the trees needed water during a dry spell, he would carry water from a nearby stream, making trip after trip with his tin pot until the ground around each tree was moist. Johnny also protected his trees from damage. If he found that deer were browsing on the young trees, he would repair or strengthen the fencing. If insects were damaging the leaves, he would pick them off by hand. He worked with a gentleness and patience that seemed almost motherly, as if each tree were a child under his care. Sometimes Johnny would find that entire sections of a nursery had failed. Perhaps a late frost had killed the young seedlings, or perhaps the site hadn't been as suitable as he'd thought. When this happened, Johnny simply planted more seeds and tried again. He never seemed discouraged by failure. He understood that growing things was always a combination of effort and luck, and that persistence would eventually bring success. Johnny didn't work for money in the usual sense. He had no interest in accumulating wealth or building a business, but he did need certain basic things to survive. A little food, occasional new clothes, perhaps some simple tools. When settlers arrived in an area where Johnny had established a nursery, they would often seek him out. They had heard about the Appleseed man and his young trees. Johnny would welcome them to his nursery and show them what he had growing. The settlers could see the value immediately. Here were apple trees that were already 2 or 3 years old, already established and hardy. If they took these trees and transplanted them carefully, they would have fruit-bearing trees within a few more years, instead of having to wait the full 8 or 10 years it took to grow a tree from seed. Johnny would trade his trees for whatever the settlers could offer. Sometimes they paid with a bit of cornmeal or flour. Sometimes they gave him old clothes or a blanket. Sometimes they simply gave him a promise that they would look after the land and treat it well. Johnny was always fair and never greedy. He wanted people to have what they needed, and he trusted that he would receive what he needed in turn. This system worked remarkably well. Settlers got their apple trees at a price they could afford, which was usually far less than buying grafted trees from professional nurserymen back east. Johnny got enough to live on, which wasn't much given his simple needs. And the frontier gained thousands of apple trees that would eventually produce millions of apples. Johnny became a familiar and welcome presence in many frontier communities. Settlers came to see him not just as a source of apple trees, but as a friend and helper. When a family was struggling to get their homestead established, Johnny would sometimes stay for a few days and help with the work. He might help clear a field, splitting logs and pulling stumps. He might help repair a cabin roof or build a barn. He never asked for payment beyond a simple meal and a place to sleep. Johnny was especially good with children. He had a gentle, patient way with young ones. He would tell them stories about the forest, about the animals he had seen, about the places he had traveled. He would show them how to recognize different types of trees and plants. Sometimes he would fashion simple toys from wood, or show them how to make whistles from willow branches. The mothers especially appreciated Johnny. He was respectful and kind, always willing to help with hard tasks, but never intrusive or demanding. In a time and place where life could be dangerous and uncertain, Johnny represented something good and pure. He reminded people that kindness still existed in the world. Fathers respected Johnny's practical knowledge. He knew so much about the land, about weather patterns, about which crops would grow best in different soils. He shared this knowledge freely, never claiming to be an expert, but simply offering what he had learned through experience. Over the years, as Johnny's work continued and his trees matured, apples became an increasingly important part of frontier life. The settlers used apples in countless ways. Fresh apples were eaten throughout autumn and early winter. They were a precious source of vitamins and natural sugar. Children looked forward to the apple harvest the way modern children look forward to Halloween candy. Apples were dried for winter storage. Thin slices would be laid out on screens or strung up like beads and hung in dry places. Dried apples took up little space and would last for months. They could be eaten as snacks or reconstituted in water to make pies and sauces. Apple cider was perhaps the most important product. Every farm needed a cider press, and when the apples were ripe, families would spend days pressing juice. The fresh cider was delicious, sweet and tangy. Some of it would be allowed to ferment into hard cider, which served as the main beverage for many adults throughout the year. Apples were also cooked into apple butter, a thick, sweet spread that could be preserved in crocks and eaten throughout the winter on bread or cornbread. Apple pies became a staple of American cooking, and the phrase, "as American as apple pie," would eventually capture how central these fruits became to national identity. Johnny saw all of this and felt a deep satisfaction. His simple work of planting seeds was bearing fruit in ways both literal and metaphorical. Families were being fed. New communities were being established. The wilderness was being transformed into settled land, and he had played a small but meaningful part in that transformation. As Ohio became more settled, Johnny continued to push westward with the frontier. He moved into Indiana, establishing nurseries there as well. The pattern was always the same. He would arrive in an area before most settlers, plant his seeds, tend his nurseries, and then be there to provide trees when families began to arrive. Johnny travelled through what would become Fort Wayne, through the areas around the Wabash River, through countless small settlements that would eventually grow into towns and cities. His work covered thousands of square miles. It's estimated that during his lifetime, Johnny planted enough trees to eventually produce millions of apples. The physical demands of this work were enormous. Johnny walked thousands of miles, carrying heavy bags of seeds, working in all weather conditions, sleeping outdoors more often than not. Yet he maintained his health and strength well into old age, perhaps because his life of constant movement and simple food kept him fit and resilient. One of the most remarkable things about Johnny Appleseed was his attitude toward animals and nature. He believed that all living creatures had value and deserved respect and kindness. Johnny would never kill an animal, not even for food. He ate a simple diet of bread, cornmeal, vegetables, and fruit. He believed that taking animal life was wrong, a belief that was quite unusual for his time and place. On the frontier, hunting and trapping were normal parts of life. Men took pride in their shooting skills and their ability to provide meat for their families. But Johnny was different. He would sometimes encounter hunters on the trail, and they would offer to share their venison or turkey with him. Johnny would politely decline, explaining that he didn't eat meat. Some hunters thought this was strange, but they respected his conviction. There was something about Johnny that made people accept his unusual ways without mockery. Johnny's care for animals extended to the smallest creatures. There are stories of him carefully stepping over insects on the trail rather than crushing them underfoot. Once, when he was building a campfire, he noticed that ants had made a nest in the wood he had gathered. Rather than destroying their home, he gathered different wood and moved his fire to another spot. Another time, Johnny found a wounded wolf caught in a trap. Most men would have killed the wolf without hesitation. Wolves were dangerous predators that threatened livestock and sometimes people. But Johnny carefully released the wolf from the trap, speaking gently to it the whole time. The wolf, perhaps sensing Johnny's good intentions, or perhaps too hurt to fight, allowed Johnny to free it. Then the wolf limped away into the forest, glancing back once at the strange man who had shown it mercy. Johnny's commitment to non-violence sometimes put him in difficult situations. There were mosquitoes and flies that would bite and sting. There were snakes that could be dangerous. There were bears and wildcats that lived in the forests he traveled through. But Johnny believed that these creatures were simply living their lives according to their nature. They didn't mean harm. They were defending themselves, or hunting for food, or protecting their territory. Johnny felt that humans had no right to destroy them, simply for being what they were. Once, Johnny was traveling through a particularly swampy area where the mosquitoes were terrible. His traveling companion complained constantly about the insects and kept swatting at them, crushing dozens with each blow. Johnny never killed a single mosquito, even though they bit him just as much. When his friend asked how he could stand it, Johnny simply said that the mosquitoes needed food too, and he could spare a little blood. This attitude might seem extreme, even foolish. But Johnny truly lived by his principles. He accepted discomfort and inconvenience rather than violate his belief that all life was sacred. Remarkably, Johnny seems to have rarely been seriously hurt by wild animals. Perhaps his calm, fearless attitude somehow communicated itself to the creatures he encountered. Or perhaps he was simply very lucky. But many people who knew him claimed that animals seemed to sense his goodness and would not attack him. Johnny's appearance became legendary throughout the frontier. He dressed in whatever cast-off clothes he could find or trade for. Often these clothes were patched and repatched until they were more patch than original fabric. He was famous for going barefoot, even in cold weather or on rocky terrain. His feet became tough and calloused, able to handle anything. People would marvel at how he could walk through thorny underbrush or across frozen ground without apparent discomfort. The tin pot on his head became his trademark. People would recognize him from a distance by that strange hat. Children would point and say, "Look, there's Johnny Appleseed." The pot served practical purposes. He could cook with it, eat from it, use it to carry water. But it also made him memorable and added to his growing legend. Johnny never seemed embarrassed by his odd appearance. He didn't apologize for his ragged clothes or his bare feet. He had more important things to think about than fashion or social expectations. This complete lack of vanity was refreshing to many people who met him. In a world where most people worried constantly about what others thought of them, Johnny was completely free of such concerns. Johnny lived by the principle of generosity. He shared whatever he had, which admittedly wasn't much, but he shared it gladly. If he had extra seeds, he gave them away to anyone who wanted them. If he had food, he shared it with hungry travelers. If he had knowledge or skills, he offered them freely to anyone who needed help. Johnny especially loved to share his apple trees. When poor families arrived on the frontier with almost nothing, Johnny would sometimes give them young trees without asking for anything in return. He trusted that they would pay him back when they could, or if they couldn't, that was all right too. Some people took advantage of his generosity, but Johnny never seemed to mind. He believed that giving freely was its own reward. This generosity extended to his time and labor as well. Johnny would help with barn raisings, with harvests, with any community work that needed doing. He never expected special treatment or extra compensation. He simply helped because he could, and because helping others brought him joy. Johnny didn't preach often, but he taught constantly through his example and through gentle conversations. He would talk about the importance of treating others well, about being patient and understanding, about seeing the good in people even when they disappointed you. He spoke about living simply and not getting caught up in the pursuit of wealth or status. He believed that happiness came from meaningful work, from connection with nature, from helping others. Children especially absorbed these lessons. There was something about Johnny that made his words stick in their minds. Years later, people who had known Johnny as children would remember specific things he had said, specific lessons he had taught. Johnny also shared his faith. He was a devout Christian, though his beliefs were somewhat unconventional. He followed the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg, a Swedish philosopher and theologian who emphasized love, compassion, and spiritual growth. Johnny carried Swedenborgian writings with him and would read them aloud to anyone who wanted to listen. But Johnny never forced his beliefs on others. He shared them as one might share a favorite book or a beautiful sunset, as something valuable that he wanted others to experience, but that they were free to accept or reject as they chose. During Johnny's lifetime, there was tremendous conflict between Native Americans and white settlers. The native tribes were being pushed off their ancestral lands, and they sometimes fought back violently. Settlers lived in fear of attacks. Soldiers were often brutal in their treatment of native people. It was a dark and sad period of American history. Johnny Appleseed somehow managed to maintain friendships with Native Americans even during these troubled times. He was known and welcomed in native villages. He learned some of their languages and customs. He treated them with the same respect and kindness he showed everyone. The native people seemed to recognize that Johnny was different from other white settlers. He wasn't taking land for himself. He wasn't trying to get rich. He wasn't threatening their way of life. He was simply planting trees and helping people, including helping native families when they were in need. There are stories of Johnny warning both settlers and Native Americans of impending attacks, trying to prevent bloodshed. He would walk through the night to deliver warnings, helping people escape to safety. His neutrality and goodwill toward all people made him trusted by both sides. In native cultures, there was often respect for people who seemed touched by the spirit world, people who lived differently and communed with nature. Johnny, with his strange ways and his gentle manner, may have been seen as such a person, someone walking a spiritual path that set him apart from ordinary men. Because of his kindness and his selfless work, Johnny was welcome in nearly every home on the frontier. Isolated families would see him approaching their cabin and would run out to greet him with genuine happiness. Johnny brought news from other settlements. In a time before newspapers or regular mail service, this was valuable. He knew who had gotten married, who had new babies, which crops were doing well in different areas, what the weather had been like elsewhere. He brought entertainment too. Johnny was a good storyteller, and his tales of his travels, of unusual things he had seen, of funny or interesting encounters, would keep families entertained for an entire evening. Most importantly, Johnny brought a sense of connection to the wider world. Frontier life could be lonely and isolating. Sometimes families would go weeks without seeing another person outside their immediate household. Johnny's visits reminded them that they were part of a larger community, that they weren't forgotten, that someone cared enough to check on them. Families would insist that Johnny stay for a meal, that he sleep by their fire rather than outside in the cold. Johnny would accept their hospitality with gratitude, though he never stayed too long in any one place. He had more seeds to plant, more trees to tend, more miles to walk. As the years passed, Johnny Appleseed's territory expanded considerably. He had started in Pennsylvania, established his main work in Ohio, and then moved into Indiana. But his travels took him through many other areas as well. Johnny walked through western Virginia and parts of what would become West Virginia. He traveled through Michigan, though not as extensively as the other areas. His territory eventually covered something like 100,000 square miles, a vast region that he knew intimately through decades of constant travel. Johnny developed regular routes that he would follow, cycling through his various nurseries to check on them, returning to communities he had visited before, and always pushing a little further west to plant new sites ahead of the advancing frontier. People began to track the seasons by Johnny's visits. Johnny Appleseed came through in early spring, so he should be back again next fall, someone might say. His visits became part of the rhythm of frontier life, as reliable as the changing seasons themselves. Johnny was growing older now, but he never seemed to slow down. His hair turned grey, then white. His face became weathered and lined from years of sun and wind. But his step remained steady, and his commitment to his work never wavered. Around campfires throughout the frontier, people told stories about Johnny Appleseed. Some of these stories were true, some were exaggerated. Some were probably completely made up, but all of them captured something essential about who Johnny was and what he meant to people. They told the story about Johnny and the wolf in the trap. With each retelling, the wolf got bigger and more dangerous. until in some versions it was practically a monster that Johnny had befriended through pure gentleness. They told stories about Johnny's extraordinary stamina, about how he could walk 30 or 40 miles in a day without seeming tired. They said he could go days without eating and didn't seem to feel cold even in winter. They told stories about Johnny's predictions and warnings. There were tales of Johnny arriving at a settlement just hours before a Native American raid, giving people time to take shelter, or of Johnny predicting harsh winters that allowed families to lay in extra supplies. Some said he had prophetic dreams that guided his travels. They told funny stories, too, about Johnny wearing a coffee sack for clothes with his tin pot on his head, being mistaken for a scarecrow. About children trying to hide when they saw him coming because his appearance was so strange, then being won over by his kindness and gentleness. The stories made Johnny larger than life, turning him from a real person into a folk hero, a legend. But Johnny himself remained humble and unchanged by his growing fame. He still lived the same simple life, still planted his seeds, still helped anyone who needed it. But by the time Johnny was in his 60s, there were few people on the frontier who hadn't heard of him. 3 generations of children had grown up hearing tales of Johnny Appleseed. Young adults remembered him visiting when they were children. Older folks had known him for decades. Johnny's apple trees had matured throughout the region. Thousands of families were eating apples from trees that Johnny had planted or sold to them. The orchards he had helped establish were feeding entire communities. When Johnny walked into a town, people would point and call out greetings. "There's Johnny Appleseed." Children would run up to him, and he would stop to talk with them, asking about their families, perhaps telling them a story or showing them a seed, and explaining how it would one day become a tall tree bearing fruit. Families would invite him to dinner. Churches would ask him to speak. Despite his simple, unconventional lifestyle, Johnny was respected and even revered by many people. They saw him as a holy man in his own way, someone who had devoted his life to serving others without asking for anything in return. Johnny accepted this recognition with his characteristic humility. He never acted as if he was special or deserved praise. He would simply say that he was doing what he felt called to do, what brought him peace and purpose. The apple trees that Johnny had planted kept growing, kept spreading. The original seeds produced trees that eventually produced more seeds, which birds and animals spread to new locations. The nurseries that Johnny had established became orchards, which produced fruit for decades. Some of Johnny's trees would live for over 100 years. Long after Johnny himself was gone, these trees would still stand, still bloom every spring, still bear fruit every autumn. They were living monuments to his work, more enduring than any statue or building could be. The settlers who had received trees from Johnny often took special care of them. They would point them out to their children and grandchildren. "That tree came from Johnny Appleseed himself," they would say with pride. The trees became treasured parts of family histories. In some places, entire towns would grow up around locations where Johnny had established his nurseries. The orchards would become commercial operations, producing apples for wider markets. The simple seeds that Johnny had planted with his own hands would eventually contribute to a major agricultural industry. During Johnny's lifetime, the frontier changed dramatically. When he had first started his work, the land beyond the Appalachian Mountains was almost completely unsettled wilderness. By the time he was old, there were roads, towns, farms everywhere he looked. The Native Americans had been pushed further west or confined to small reservations. The vast forests had been cut down to create farmland. Wild animals that had once been abundant were becoming rare. The frontier, in many ways, was disappearing. Johnny had mixed feelings about these changes. He was glad that families had homes and communities, that children had schools and churches, that life was less dangerous and uncertain than it had been. His own work had contributed to this settlement and development. But he also mourned the loss of the wilderness he had loved, the endless forests where a man could walk for days without seeing another human, the abundant wildlife, the sense of untouched nature that had first called him west. Johnny adapted by continuing to move westward himself, staying ahead of the heaviest settlement, finding new frontier areas where his work was still needed. But he must have known that eventually the frontier would be completely settled, and the America he had known would exist only in memory. Johnny was well into his 70s now, an impressive age for anyone in that era, particularly for someone who lived as he did. Most people his age, if they were still alive, were being cared for by their families, sitting by the fire and telling stories of the old days. But Johnny kept walking. He kept planting. He kept tending his nurseries. His body was older and probably more tired than he would admit, but his spirit remained strong. He believed his work was important, perhaps even sacred, and he would continue as long as he was able. People who saw him during these later years remarked on his unchanged nature. He was still gentle, still kind, still barefoot, still wearing his tin pot and his ragged clothes. Time had marked his body, but had not changed who he was inside. Johnny still slept outdoors most of the time, still walked incredible distances, still shared whatever he had with others. If anything, he seemed even more at peace than before, as if he had found exactly the life he was meant to live and was content with how he had spent his years. Even in his final years, Johnny Appleseed continued his mission. He didn't retire or settle down in one place. He remained on the move, traveling his familiar routes, checking on his established nurseries, and planting new ones wherever he saw an opportunity. Johnny's pace had slowed somewhat. He couldn't cover quite as many miles in a day as he once had. He needed to rest more often. But his determination never flagged. He would wake each morning as the sun rose, gather his few belongings, and continue his journey. People who saw him during these last years were often struck by how peaceful he seemed. There was a serenity in his face, a calmness that suggested a life well lived without regrets. He would smile easily and had a gentle word for everyone he met. Johnny's final planting trips took him through areas he had visited many times before. He would stop at farms where he had sold trees decades earlier, and those trees would now be mature and productive. He took quiet satisfaction in seeing the results of his life's work spread out across the landscape. Johnny had never married or had children of his own. He had no permanent home, no accumulated wealth, no possessions beyond what he could carry. By conventional measures, he had very little to show for his 70-some years of life. But Johnny measured his life differently. He measured it in apple trees planted, in families helped, in kindnesses given and received. By these measures, his life had been extraordinarily rich and successful. Johnny knew that his trees would outlive him. He knew that children not yet born would eat apples from trees he had planted. He knew that his work had helped countless families establish themselves on the frontier, had contributed to the building of communities and the growth of a nation. This knowledge brought Johnny deep satisfaction. He had found his purpose early in life and had devoted himself to it completely. He had lived according to his values, had harmed no one, and had helped many. What more could a person ask from life? In March of 1845, Johnny was traveling through northern Indiana. He had been visiting various settlements and checking on his nurseries in the area. The spring weather was unpredictable, with warm days followed by cold nights, rain followed by sunshine. Johnny stopped at a farmhouse owned by a family he had known for years. He seemed more tired than usual, but he was in good spirits. He shared a meal with the family and spoke with them about the trees in the area, about the spring planting that would soon begin. That night, Johnny developed a fever. The family urged him to stay and rest, to let them care for him. Johnny agreed, which was unusual for him. He must have known that something was seriously wrong. Over the next couple of days, Johnny's condition worsened. He developed what was probably pneumonia, a serious illness that was often fatal in that era, especially for someone of Johnny's age. The family did what they could, keeping him comfortable, making sure he had water, sitting with him so he wouldn't be alone. Johnny Appleseed died on March 18th, 1845, in that farmhouse in Indiana. He was about 71 years old. His passing was peaceful and quiet, much like the life he had lived. The family who had cared for him in his final days prepared his body for burial. They dressed him in clean clothes, though he probably would have been just as content in his old ragged ones. Word spread quickly through the area that Johnny Appleseed had died. People came from surrounding farms and settlements to pay their respects. Many of them had known Johnny for decades. Some had been children when they first met him, and were now parents themselves, telling their own children about the gentle man who had planted apple trees throughout the land. There were tears at Johnny's death, but there was also a sense of celebration for a life well lived. People shared stories about Johnny, remembering his kindness, his unusual ways, his dedication to his mission. They spoke of the times he had helped them, the trees he had given them, the gentle wisdom he had shared. Johnny Appleseed was buried in a simple grave near where he died. There was no elaborate funeral, no marble monument. The grave was marked simply, in keeping with the life Johnny had lived. But nature provided its own memorial. Apple trees grew nearby, perhaps descended from seeds Johnny himself had planted. In spring, these trees would bloom with white and pink flowers. In autumn, they would bear fruit. The trees would continue doing what Johnny had spent his life encouraging them to do, growing, living, providing. Over time, the exact location of Johnny's grave was lost. There are several places that claim to be his burial site, and perhaps that's fitting. Johnny had belonged to no single place. The entire frontier had been his home. Maybe it's appropriate that his final resting place is somewhat uncertain, part of the legend rather than fixed in stone. The communities that Johnny had served didn't forget him. His name was spoken with affection and respect. Parents told their children about Johnny Appleseed, about his kindness and his unusual ways, about how he had walked across the frontier planting apple trees for others. The trees Johnny had planted stood as living reminders of his work. Every time someone ate an apple from one of those trees, every time someone pressed cider from their fruit, every time children climbed their branches, Johnny's legacy continued. Some of the people who had known Johnny best made efforts to preserve his memory. They wrote down stories about him, trying to separate fact from legend, trying to record what the real John Chapman had been like. These accounts would eventually be collected and published, ensuring that future generations would know about Johnny Appleseed. Johnny Appleseed's work had lasting impact on the landscape of America. The trees he planted, and the descendants of those trees, spread across Ohio, Indiana, Pennsylvania, and beyond. By the time of Johnny's death, there were thousands of mature apple trees that he had planted or that had grown from his nurseries. Over the following decades, these trees produced millions of apples. The seeds from these apples produced more trees, which produced more apples in an ongoing cycle of growth and abundance. Entire orchards descended from Johnny's original plantings. Some of these orchards continued producing fruit well into the 20th century, more than 100 years after Johnny had first planted the seeds. Even today, there are a few very old apple trees scattered across the Midwest that may have descended from Johnny's work. The varieties of apples that grew from Johnny's seeds were diverse. Because Johnny planted from seed rather than grafting, each tree was genetically unique. Most of the apples were best for cider, rather than eating fresh. But that was what the frontier needed most. Johnny Appleseed became more than just a man who planted trees. He became a symbol of American frontier life, representing qualities that Americans like to think defined their national character. He represented self-reliance and independence. Johnny had lived on his own terms, following his own path, not depending on others or conforming to social expectations. He represented generosity and community spirit. Johnny had devoted his life to helping others, to making life better for the settlers who were building new homes in the wilderness. He represented harmony with nature. Johnny had lived simply, had refused to harm animals or the land unnecessarily, had worked with natural processes rather than against them. He represented faith and purpose. Johnny had believed in something larger than himself and had dedicated his life to serving that purpose. These qualities resonated with Americans' image of themselves and their history. Johnny Appleseed became a hero in the American mythology, right alongside other frontier figures like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett. Johnny Appleseed's story was particularly well suited for children. It had all the elements of a good tale: adventure, kindness, unusual characters, and a clear moral about helping others and living according to your values. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Johnny Appleseed's story was included in school textbooks and children's books. These versions often simplified or romanticized his life, but they captured the essential truth of who he had been. Children learned about Johnny walking across the frontier with his tin pot hat and his bag of seeds. They learned about his kindness to animals and his generosity to pioneers. They learned that one person, living simply and working steadily, could make a real difference in the world. Teachers used Johnny's story to teach values like persistence, kindness, and environmental stewardship. Johnny became a role model, an example of how to live a good life. The story was especially popular in the Midwest, in the states where Johnny had actually worked. Children would visit old orchards and be told that some of those trees came from seeds Johnny Appleseed had planted. This made history feel real and present, not just something that happened long ago in distant places. Over time, Johnny Appleseed became deeply embedded in American culture. His name became proverbial. Like Johnny Appleseed meant someone who spread good things wherever they went, someone who thought about the future and planted seeds that would grow long after they were gone. Towns and schools were named after him. Festivals celebrated his life and work, Artists painted pictures of him. Poets wrote verses about him. Walt Disney made an animated film that introduced Johnny Appleseed to new generations. Each retelling of the story added new elements or emphasized different aspects of Johnny's life. Some versions focused on his religious faith. Others emphasized his environmental awareness and gentle treatment of animals. Some portrayed him as almost magical, able to talk with animals and predict the future. But through all these variations, certain core elements remained constant. Johnny was always kind. He always helped others. He always lived simply and dedicated himself to planting apple trees. These essential truths kept the story grounded, even as it grew into legend. More than 150 years after his death, Johnny Appleseed remains well known in America. School children still learn his story. His name is still instantly recognizable. This endurance is remarkable. Most people from the early 1800s, even those who were famous in their own time, have been forgotten. But Johnny Appleseed lives on in memory and imagination. Perhaps this is because his story speaks to something universal, the desire to leave the world better than you found it, the belief that simple actions, repeated consistently, can create lasting change, the idea that a life of service and kindness is more valuable than a life of wealth and power. Johnny Appleseed reminds us that one person can make a difference, not through grand gestures or dramatic actions, but through steady, faithful work, guided by clear values and sincere care for others. Today, it's difficult to separate the real John Chapman from the legendary Johnny Appleseed. The stories have been told and retold so many times, with embellishments added and details changed, that the historical person and the folk hero have become intertwined. But perhaps that's appropriate. Johnny lived in an era when America itself was being created, when the nation's character was being formed. He contributed to that creation not just through his apple trees, but through the example he set and the values he embodied. The real John Chapman was probably less consistently saintly than the legend suggests. He was human, with human flaws and limitations. He may have had bad days when he was cranky or discouraged. He probably made mistakes and had regrets like everyone does. But the essential truth of the legend is accurate. John Chapman really did spend his life walking across the frontier planting apple trees. He really did live simply and help others generously. He really was kind to animals and gentle with people. He really did dedicate himself to a purpose larger than personal gain. And in doing so, he created something that lasted far beyond his own lifetime. The trees he planted have long since died, but new trees have grown from their seeds. The communities he helped establish have grown into cities. The values he lived by continue to inspire new generations. Johnny Appleseed's story is a reminder that quiet, faithful work matters. That kindness ripples out in ways we can't always see or measure. That living according to your values, even when those values are unconventional, can create something beautiful and lasting. If you visit the Midwest today, you might still find very old apple trees growing in unexpected places. In a corner of a farm field, along an old fence line, in a patch of woods near a forgotten homestead. Some of these trees might be descendants of the seeds Johnny Appleseed planted 200 years ago. There's no way to know for certain. The trees don't carry labels or records, but they stand there still, weathered and gnarled, their roots deep in American soil, their branches reaching towards the sky. In spring, these old trees still bloom. The flowers are just as white and pink as they ever were. Bees still visit them, gathering pollen and nectar. The scent is just as sweet. In autumn, these old trees still bear fruit. The apples may be small and tart, better for cider than for eating fresh, but they're real apples nonetheless, continuing the cycle that Johnny set in motion so long ago. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirit of Johnny Appleseed still walks, not as a ghost or a supernatural presence, but as an idea, an inspiration, a reminder that one person's quiet dedication can create ripples that spread across generations. He walks in every person who plants a tree for future generations, in every person who helps others without expecting reward, in every person who lives simply and treats all living things with kindness, in every person who believes that making the world a little better, in whatever small way you can, is a worthwhile way to spend your time on Earth. Johnny Appleseed's journey never really ended. It continues in the trees that still grow, in the stories that are still told, in the lives of people who are inspired by his example. And perhaps that's the greatest legacy anyone could hope for. Not wealth or fame or power, but the knowledge that your life mattered, that your work continues, that you planted seeds that would grow and flourish long after you were gone. Johnny Appleseed understood that some of the best things we do, we never see completed. He planted seeds knowing it would take years for them to become trees, knowing he might not live to see them fully mature. But he planted them anyway, with faith that the work was worthwhile, that future people would benefit, that small acts of service and kindness create value that endures. As you drift towards sleep tonight, think of those apple trees, growing slowly and steadily, blooming each spring, bearing fruit each fall, their roots deep and their branches wide, standing as quiet monuments to a gentle man who walked across America, planting seeds of kindness. And rest well, knowing that tomorrow is another day, another chance to plant your own seeds, whatever they may be. The end. If you are still awake, try our other movie story videos. Subscribe if you liked the video. Thanks.